The year 1832. A chill wind whispers through the budding trees of upstate New York, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and unspoken secrets. In a time when shadows clung to gas lamps and superstition danced with science, there stood a place whispered about in hushed tones, the Blackwood Manor Orphanage. They called it that because of its dark, foreboding stone, but some said it was because of the even darker things that happened within its walls. A place where children arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and the ghosts of their pasts, and where sometimes they simply vanished. Our story begins with one such arrival, a girl named Lillian, who carried a secret far heavier than her small frame suggested. A secret that would unravel the very fabric of Blackwood Manor, revealing the chilling truth behind the Orphanage of Mirrors. Lillian clutched her worn cloth doll tighter, her knuckles white against the faded fabric. The carriage ride had been long, bumping her small body against the hard leather seat for what felt like an eternity. Each jolt was a reminder of what she'd lost, of the familiar warmth of her mother's hand, now a ghost against her cheek. Outside the window, the world was a blur of early spring greens and the skeletal remains of winter's grip. Then, a stark, imposing silhouette emerged against the overcast sky, Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, its dark stone walls seemingly absorbing the meager light of the afternoon. Turrets rose like skeletal fingers, reaching for the heavens, and its windows, narrow and numerous, stared out like vacant eyes. A sense of foreboding settled over Lillian, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. This wasn't like the cozy, albeit small, home she'd known. This was a fortress, a prison. The carriage groaned to a halt, stirring Lillian from her silent dread. A gruff voice from the driver announced their arrival. Lillian's assigned escort, a stiff woman with a perpetually pursed mouth named Miss Primrose, nudged her forward. "Come along, child. Don't dawdle. Director Sterling doesn't appreciate tardiness." Lillian slid off the seat, her small boots crunching on the gravel drive. The air was heavy, damp, and carried a faint, metallic scent she couldn't place. As they approached the massive oak front doors, she noticed something peculiar. Embedded in the stone walls on either side of the entrance, and even in the heavy door itself, were small, tarnished metal frames. Inside each frame, instead of glass, was a piece of polished, dark wood, reflecting nothing but distorted shadows. They weren't mirrors, not truly, but they caught the light in an unsettling way, like blind eyes staring back. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous entryway. The air inside was colder, dustier, and held the faint scent of old paper and something else, something akin to ozone after a storm. Director Sterling stood waiting, a tall, slender man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wore a severe dark suit, and his posture was rigid, almost military. A thin smile, more a bearing of teeth than genuine warmth, stretched across his lips. "Welcome, Lillian." His voice was smooth, almost silken, yet it carried an unsettling undertone. "We've been expecting you." Lillian said nothing, merely clutching her doll tighter. She felt a prickle of unease under his gaze, as if he could see right through her, past her thin dress, and into the secret she held so close. Miss Primrose, her usual stern demeanor softened slightly by a nervous tremor, handed over Lillian's meager papers. "Another orphan, Director," she said, her voice hushed. 10 years old, no living relatives." Director Sterling nodded, his gaze never leaving Lillian. "Indeed, such a tragedy. But here, at Blackwood Manor, you will find a new family, a new purpose." His words were meant to be comforting, but they landed with the chill of a tombstone. Lillian scanned the grand hall. It was dimly lit by gas lamps, casting long, dancing shadows. Her eyes were drawn to the walls again. More of the strange, dark wooden frames. Hundreds of them, covering every available surface, stretching up into the gloom. They weren't reflecting the room, not properly. They just showed a murky, warped version of what was in front of them, like looking into still, dark water. The sheer number of them was dizzying, creating a disorienting, unsettling effect. It was as if the very walls were watching, their dark, distorted eyes following her every move. This was the Orphanage of Mirrors, though she didn't know it yet, and its unsettling reflections were only the beginning of its secrets. Lillian was led through a labyrinth of dimly lit corridors, each one mirroring the last in its oppressive stillness and the pervasive presence of the dark, reflective frames. They weren't just on the walls of the grand hall. They adorned every passageway, every nook and cranny. Some were small, no bigger than a teacup saucer, while others were vast, floor-to-ceiling panels that didn't reflect the room so much as distorted into abstract, frightening shapes. It made walking difficult, the constant shifting and warping of her surroundings turning her stomach. She was introduced to Miss Primrose, the governess who would oversee her daily life. Miss Primrose was everything her name suggested: stiff, dry, and smelling faintly of starch and lavender. Her rules were delivered with a snap that tolerated no argument. Silence is golden, child. Obedience is essential. Curiosity, she warned, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, is a luxury no orphan here can afford. Lillian was then taken to the dormitory. It was a large, drafty room with rows of thin iron beds, separated by tattered privacy screens. About 20 other children, ranging from 6 to perhaps 15, stopped their meager activities and stared at her, the new arrival. They were all pale, dressed in drab, ill-fitting gray clothes, and wore expressions that were a mixture of fear and profound exhaustion. A girl slightly older than Lillian, perhaps 12, with fierce, intelligent eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair, stepped forward. She carried herself with a defiant slump, clearly an unofficial leader among the children. "Don't mind them," the girl said, her voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I'm Clara, and you'll want the bed by the window. It's colder, but the morning light is worth it." Clara's unexpected kindness was a small spark in the cold room. Lillian managed a weak smile. "Lillian, thank you." Later that evening, while the other children were preparing for their meager dinner, Clara leaned close to Lillian, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "The frames," she whispered, nodding toward one of the dark, oblong shapes near their beds. "Don't look into them for too long. They don't like it." Lillian frowned, confused. "But they're not mirrors." "What are they?" "We call them the blind eyes," Clara explained, her voice barely audible. "They're not mirrors, no? They're polished obsidian wood. Old. Director Sterling says they are merely decorative, relics from the manor's previous owner, a ship captain who traveled the world. But the children who have been here longest, they know better. They feel the cold coming off them. And sometimes, when the gas lamps flicker just so, you can see movement inside the surface. Not your own reflection, but something else. Something deep within the wood." The story sent a shiver down Lillian's spine. It felt fantastical, yet the palpable atmosphere of dread in the manor made it easy to believe. Clara grew serious, her fingers tracing the outline of a scar on her forearm. "Listen, Lillian. We had another girl here, just last month. Agnes. She was quiet, kept to herself. She spent too long looking at the blind eyes in the library. Just staring, trying to see what was behind the distortion. One morning, her bed was empty. Director Sterling simply said she was reassigned, but Agnes left everything behind. Everything. They don't get reassigned here, Lillian. They disappear." Lillian looked at the dark frame near her bed, a profound fear taking root. The distorted, shadowy surface seemed to deepen, drawing in the light. She swore, for a fleeting second, that the vague shadow within shifted, like a face dissolving in smoke. The daily routine at Blackwood Manor was a monotonous, soul-crushing cycle of chores, thin gruel, and dreary lessons in a dusty classroom. Director Sterling taught history and mathematics with a chilling lack of passion, treating the children more like objects to be cataloged than minds to be nurtured. The overarching lesson, however, was constant vigilance and silence. The manor itself seemed to enforce this rule, the heavy doors muffling sounds, and the dark corridors discouraging any unauthorized movement. But it was the frames, the blind eyes, that were the true wardens of the Orphanage of Mirrors. They were everywhere, in the dining hall, the washrooms, lining the staircases. Lillian began to realize they weren't placed randomly. In every room, there seemed to be a perfect vantage point for one of the frames to observe the occupants. They were a constant, silent presence, and the children moved around them with the instinctive caution of prey avoiding a predator's gaze. Lillian found herself drawn to Clara, who, despite her cynical exterior, possessed a practical knowledge of the manor and a fierce protectiveness over the younger children. Clara had a map of the manor in her head, marking the squeaky floorboards, the locked doors, and, most importantly, the areas with the densest concentration of the blind eyes. The East Wing is the worst, Clara confided one afternoon while they were scrubbing the endless wooden floors of the library. The entire hall is paneled with them. No one goes there but Director Sterling and Miss Primrose. And once a week, an older boy named Barnaby is sent into dust. He hates it, says the cold in that wing isn't just drafty, it's wrong. Lillian's hands paused in their scrubbing. Wrong how? Clara lowered her voice further. He says he hears whispers, like dry leaves scratching on stone. And he says that those frames, the ones in the East Wing, they reflect things. Not just distorted shadows, but whole, clear images. Images of rooms we don't have here. And faces. This was a major difference. The frames they saw every day only showed warped darkness, a distorted non-reflection. But clear images? That was truly unsettling. Lillian had her own peculiar experience to share. She hadn't told anyone yet, not even Clara, about the secret she carried. A small, silver locket her mother had given her, containing a miniature portrait of her father, a man she barely remembered. It was hidden deep in the lining of her doll. But her secret was more than the locket. Since arriving, she had noticed something about the blind eyes, a brief, momentary flicker, like a camera flash, whenever she passed a large one quickly. And when she wore the locket, the flickering was more pronounced. One night, unable to sleep, Lillian risked a walk to the washroom. The gas lamp in the hall was sputtering, casting the corridor in an anxious rhythm of light and shadow. As she passed a tall, narrow frame, she moved too quickly, and the momentary flash happened again. This time, however, it lasted a fraction of a second longer. In that brief, blinding moment, she didn't see a distorted shadow. She saw a clear, sharp reflection of herself, but not her current self. She was wearing a dress of fine blue velvet, her hair adorned with a ribbon, standing in a brightly lit room filled with laughter. A memory? Or something else? The image vanished instantly, leaving only the dark, murky wood staring back. Lillian stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the small, smooth bump of the silver locket hidden beneath her thin nightgown. The frames weren't just watching, they were reacting to her. They were responding to something she possessed. The realization that the dark frames, the Orphanage of Mirrors, were somehow sensitive to her presence became Lillian's central, terrifying secret. She started conducting small, clandestine experiments. By day, during her scrubbing duties, she would walk past the frames at different speeds, with and without her doll, and thus, the locket, close to her body. She confirmed it. The flash was strongest when the locket was near, and she moved quickly. The flashes were always the same type of image, brief, vivid glimpses of a life she didn't live. Not her life with her mother, which was poor but warm, but a life of luxury, of fine clothes and bright rooms. She was seeing an alternate reality, or perhaps a stolen memory. This only deepened her connection to the strange fate of Agnes, the girl who had vanished after staring too long. Lillian decided she had to know what was in the East Wing. If the common frames reacted to her, what would the densely packed panels there reveal? She sought out Clara, who was polishing silverware under the hawk-like supervision of Miss Primrose. "I need to get into the East Wing," Lillian whispered during a moment when Miss Primrose's back was turned. Clara nearly dropped a silver fork. "Are you mad? That's asking to be reassigned. I have to know what happened to Agnes," Lillian insisted, pulling Clara toward a dim corner. "And I think those frames are the key. The ones here, they show flashes of things that aren't real. But you said Barnaby saw clear reflections in the East Wing. That's where the secret is." Clara chewed on her lip, her fierce eyes thoughtful. "Barnaby says Director Sterling locks the main door, but there's a small service entrance near the scullery that he uses. It's usually bolted from the inside, but he leaves the key hidden in an old, chipped ceramic jar next to the laundry chute. He thinks no one knows." The two girls hatched a plan. The scullery, being hot and noisy, was usually deserted after the evening meal cleanup. Their window of opportunity would be a brief 15 minutes before they were required to be in the dormitories for evening prayers. The risk was enormous. Getting caught in the East Wing would certainly mean severe punishment, possibly something worse. That night, the air in the manor felt thick and oppressive. Lillian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. As soon as Miss Primrose dismissed them, muttering a quick, "good night," Lillian grabbed Clara's arm. They slipped away from the stream of children, weaving through the shadows toward the scullery. The key was exactly where Clara described, tucked inside a chipped ceramic jar. It was a heavy, cold iron key, and it felt strangely potent in Lillian's palm. They crept toward the service door, a small, unassuming portal tucked behind a dusty pile of discarded coal sacks. The key grated in the lock, the sound deafening in the silence of the back halls. As the door swung inward on rusty hinges, a blast of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying that familiar, metallic scent. Lillian felt a terrifying thrill mixed with dread. They were in the East Wing, and as they took their first tentative steps onto the polished, marble floor, the silence around them deepened, becoming a living thing. The East Wing was radically different from the rest of Blackwood Manor. It wasn't just older or dustier. It felt sterile, almost preserved. The main difference, however, was the frames. Here, the dark, obsidian wood didn't just line the walls, it was the walls. Floor-to-ceiling panels covered every surface, unbroken stretches of the disturbing, non-reflective material. The sheer number created a suffocating atmosphere, a silent gallery of blind eyes staring into an unseen dimension. Lillian clutched her locket, feeling the subtle vibration she had come to associate with the frame's reaction. The cold that radiated from the panels was intense, causing her breath to plume in the air. As they walked, the gas lamp Clara had pilfered cast their shadows into grotesque, elongated shapes that were immediately absorbed and warped by the obsidian walls. "This is madness," Clara whispered, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter. "I feel like 1,000 eyes are on us, even though none of them are actually seeing." Lillian was mesmerized. She approached the nearest panel, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the cold, slick surface. No distorted shadow, no reflection of herself, only the deep, swirling darkness of the wood grain. Then, she noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible hum in the air, low enough to be felt rather than heard. It was the same ozone smell she noticed upon first entering the manor, but intensified. As she stepped closer, the vibration in the locket grew stronger. She willed herself to move quickly, testing her theory. She took 3 rapid steps past the panel. Flash. It wasn't the brief, blurry glimpse she usually saw. This time, the image lasted almost a full second. It was clear, bright, and terrifyingly real. She saw Agnes, the missing girl, but she wasn't alone. Agnes was standing in a small, square room that was completely white, illuminated by a brilliant light source. She was wearing a different dress, a plain, soft gray, and her hair was neat. She looked perfectly fine, utterly calm. She was smiling, but it was a vacant, distant smile that chilled Lillian to the bone. The image snapped back to the dark wood. Lillian stumbled backward, gasping. "What did you see?" Clara demanded, rushing to her side. "Lillian, your face. What was it?" "Agnes," Lillian choked out, trying to steady her breathing. She's in a white room." She looked fine, Clara, but her eyes, they were empty, like someone had washed the feeling right out of them. Clara's face paled. "A white room." Barnaby mentioned a white room. He said he saw a flash of a woman in a uniform, too. He thought he was losing his mind. Lillian pointed to a section of the wall where the obsidian panels met a small, inconspicuous wooden door that was flush with the wall. It looked like part of the paneling, expertly disguised. "We need to go further. This isn't just decoration. This whole wing is a secret. Maybe they're not mirrors at all, but windows." They continued down the hall, the cold intensifying, the metallic scent growing stronger. As they reached the end, they found a wide, ornate double door, also paneled with the dark wood, leading into what must have been the manor's original ballroom. Here, the panels were enormous, towering over them like silent, black sentinels. In the center of the floor, a lone, low table stood, and on it, a single object. It was a large, circular concave disc, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, made of the same obsidian wood, but polished to an impossible, liquid-like sheen. Unlike all the other frames, this one was not fixed to the wall. It sat on its own pedestal, humming with a low, deep resonance. Lillian and Clara approached the central obsidian disc with a fearful reverence. It wasn't merely a decorative piece. It was clearly the heart of the East Wing, perhaps the source of the subtle energy that permeated the entire manor. The humming intensified as they drew closer, causing the small silver locket around Lillian's neck to feel hot against her skin. Clara kept her distance, her hands covering her mouth. It feels like a great, cold eye watching us. Let's go, Lillian. We've seen enough. But Lillian couldn't move. She was drawn to the disc, compelled by a force she didn't understand. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the curved, obsidian surface. The surface shimmered, not with light, but with an internal darkness. She saw nothing but a deep, infinite swirl, like looking into the heart of a galaxy. Then, she took a breath, moved her hand the final inch, and pressed her palm flat against the cold wood. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The low hum became a high-pitched, metallic shriek that reverberated through the vast, empty ballroom. The light from Clara's lamp flickered wildly, and all the obsidian panels lining the walls flashed simultaneously, like 1,000 dark eyes opening at once. Lillian cried out, stumbling backward. The frames on the walls weren't showing distorted shadows anymore. They were showing scenes, a rapid-fire montage of images. The inside of the White Room, Agnes smiling vacantly, the woman in a nurse's uniform that Barnaby had described, Director Sterling standing over a piece of strange, complex machinery. And then, the image that stopped Lillian's heart. Her mother. Her mother was alive. She was sitting in a chair, facing away, in a dimly lit room that was unfamiliar. She was wearing a dress Lillian didn't recognize. The image was brief, but it was undeniably her. Then, just as quickly, the images vanished, the walls reverted to their dark, menacing stillness, and the oppressive humming faded back to a low, barely perceptible resonance. Lillian's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, gasping. "My mother," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's here. I saw her. I think she's here." Clara helped her up, her face a mask of terror and confusion. "Lillian, we have to leave now." That sound, it was loud. Director Sterling will have heard it. As if on cue, they heard a heavy, rhythmic thudding from the far end of the hall. Someone was coming, and they weren't trying to be quiet. They scrambled back toward the small service door, their boots slipping on the marble. The thudding grew louder, closer. They heard a voice, sharp and commanding. "Director Sterling." "I heard that. Someone is in the East Wing. Miss Primrose, search the halls. Seal the perimeter." Lillian, driven by adrenaline and the horrifying knowledge of her mother's presence, shoved the key into the service door lock. It turned with a screech of rusty protest just as Director Sterling's heavy footsteps rounded the corner. He was a terrifying sight, his face a mask of rage, holding a thick, polished cane that looked disturbingly heavy. They burst through the door, yanking it shut just as Sterling reached it. The key wouldn't turn in the lock, stuck halfway. "Run!" Clara screamed, pulling Lillian toward the main manor hall. They heard a furious crash from behind them as Director Sterling slammed his entire weight against the service door. Lillian and Clara raced through the familiar, yet now terrifying, maze of the main manor corridors. The adrenaline of the confrontation was quickly replaced by a desperate, pounding terror. The thudding footsteps of Director Sterling were close behind, punctuated by his cold, furious shouts. "Stop them! Stop those little thieves!" They ducked into the laundry room, hiding behind a mountain of damp, freshly washed sheets. Lillian was shaking uncontrollably, still reeling from the sight of her mother in the mirror's brief vision. "She's here." The thought was both a terrifying anchor and a beacon of hope. Clara, despite her fear, was all focus. "We can't go back to the dormitory. Primrose will be there, waiting. We need to hide somewhere until morning roll call." Lillian remembered Barnaby's secret access door, the one that looked like part of the East Wing paneling. If they could get back into the wing and relock the service door from the inside, Sterling might be briefly confused. It was a mad, desperate idea, but the main manor was a trap. "The study," Lillian gasped, pointing toward Director Sterling's private office, which was directly across the hall from the laundry room. "Barnaby said he keeps a ledger of all the children. We need to find the truth, Clara. Why did the frame show us Agnes and my mother?" The risk was astronomical, but the potential reward. understanding the manor's dark heart, was worth it. They slipped out from the laundry room, darting across the hall and into the unlit, imposing entrance of Director Sterling's study. The door was thankfully unlocked, an oversight born of the director's haste. The study was small but opulent, unlike the rest of the manor. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, bathed in the moonlight filtering through a single tall window. And on the wall behind the desk, framed and perfectly centered, was a single, large blind eye, unlike any they had seen before. It was rectangular, about 5 feet tall, and its obsidian surface was pristine, reflecting the moonlight with a faint, oily sheen. Clara immediately went to the desk, rifling through the drawers, her movements quick and efficient. Lillian, meanwhile, found herself drawn to the lone, perfect frame. The low-frequency hum was present here, too, emanating from the obsidian. As she approached, she saw her own reflection, but this time, it was a perfectly clear, crisp image, not distorted or dark. It was the first true reflection she had seen in the entire manor, and it was breathtakingly sharp. But the sharpness was wrong. Her reflection looked pale, frightened, and hollow. And as she watched, the light inside the reflection seemed to draw away, leaving her mirrored image flat and lifeless, like a photograph being drained of its color. She instinctively pulled her hand away, shuddering. "Found it," Clara whispered triumphantly. She held up a thick, leather-bound book, clearly the ledger. She flipped it open quickly. Here are the names: Lillian, Clara, Barnaby, Agnes. She traced a finger across the page. Next to Agnes's name, the entry read, "Reassigned. Phase 1 complete. Location, Sector 7. Lillian leaned in, her eyes wide with dread. Phase 1. What does that mean? Clara continued scanning the page. At the bottom, a list of children's names, crossed out in a neat red ink, was followed by a chilling, single word, harvested. The word harvested hung in the dusty air of the study, a silent, chilling verdict. Lillian and Clara stared at the ledger, the moonlight illuminating the brutal finality of the red ink. This wasn't a school, or even a normal, cruel orphanage. It was something darker, something industrial and terrifying. Harvested, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. They didn't just disappear. They were used for something. Lillian's gaze drifted back to the massive, reflective obsidian frame behind the desk. Its clear reflection of her own face, momentarily, felt like a warning. She remembered the flash of her mother and the clear image of Agnes in the white room. The frames, Lillian said, her mind racing. It all goes back to the frames. They're not just watching, they're doing something. They show me my mother. She's part of this, somehow. They heard the muffled sound of Director Sterling's voice nearby, now talking to Miss Primrose, their search moving toward the central part of the manor. Time was running out. We need to find this Sector 7, Lillian decided, slamming the ledger shut. And we need to find what this Phase 1 means. Where would he keep a lab? Or a special area? Clara pointed to a blueprint taped to the wall behind the ledger, partially obscured by a curtain. It was a schematic of the manor. The east wing was clearly labeled, but a section underneath the ballroom was marked with thick red lines and the cryptic notation: Observation and Transfer Vault. V1. Underground, Clara stated grimly. That must be Sector 7. The transfer vault. They scanned the study for any sign of a hidden passage or a separate entrance. Lillian's eyes fixed on the small, square pedestal of the desk, just a foot off the ground. She remembered how the single, perfect obsidian frame on the wall had reacted to her presence. The small silver locket around her neck, hidden under her dress, felt cold again, radiating a soft, tingling energy. She cautiously pressed the locket against the edge of the large frame. Nothing. She moved it to the center. Nothing. Then, she tried the corner of the frame closest to the floor. A soft, almost imperceptible click echoed in the silence. The floor panel under the desk silently slid back, revealing a dark, narrow flight of stone steps leading down into the earth. The air that rose from the opening was heavy and saturated with the metallic, ozone scent. The key, Clara muttered, understanding instantly. It's not just a reflective surface. It's a lock. The locket must be the key. They didn't hesitate. Clara went first, pulling the ledger from the desk and clutching it tightly. Lillian followed, carefully pulling the floor panel back into place. They were now sealed beneath the earth, plunging into the dark, cold secrets of the Orphanage of Mirrors. The stone steps were slick with dampness and descended in a tight, twisting spiral, forcing Lillian and Clara to feel their way in absolute darkness. The air grew progressively colder and thicker, heavy with the unique, almost electrical scent they associated with the obsidian frames. They could hear the faint, muffled sounds of Director Sterling and Miss Primrose's search above them, their voices echoing off the stone ceilings of the main manor. After what felt like an endless descent, the stairs opened onto a short corridor. Gaslight flickered faintly at the end, illuminating a heavy, iron door marked with a crudely painted 7. Sector 7. As they approached the door, the low, deep hum from the East Wing's ballroom returned, stronger here, almost vibrating in their bones. Lillian realized the sound wasn't coming from the room above, but from behind the iron door. Clara tried the handle. It was, predictably, locked. "We're trapped," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. Lillian immediately reached for her locket. The locket was now pulsing, a faint, almost warm throb against her chest. She held it out and tentatively pressed the silver metal against the iron door near the handle. This time, there was no click. Instead, a complex, almost musical sequence of tiny gears whirred into motion inside the thick iron. A small, square panel on the door slid open, revealing a patch of the same dark, polished obsidian wood. It was a lock, but not one for a key. It was a lock for the locket. Lillian placed the locket flat against the obsidian patch. The thrumming intensified, and the air around the door crackled with an invisible energy. Then, with a heavy thunk, the bolts on the iron door retracted. They pushed the heavy door open. They had found the transfer vault. The room was vast and circular, built entirely of smooth, white marble, exactly like the room Agnes was in. It was brilliantly lit by a single, powerful light source overhead that cast no shadows. In the center, a huge version of the obsidian disc from the ballroom stood on a pedestal 3 times its size, humming powerfully. It was the master mirror, the V, one they saw on the blueprint. Around the perimeter of the room were several metal cages, each just large enough to hold a single person. And inside 2 of the cages, sitting motionless on narrow benches, were Agnes and another girl Lillian vaguely recognized from the older group of orphans. They were dressed in soft, plain gray clothes, and their faces were serene, their eyes wide and completely empty. Then Lillian saw her. Caged in the center, directly opposite the massive mirror, was her mother. Lillian's breath caught in her throat, a wave of shock and relief washing over her. Her mother looked gaunt and weary, dressed in the same plain gray as the other girls. She was awake, but her gaze was distant, fixed on the massive obsidian disc at the center of the vault. "Mother!" Lillian cried out, rushing forward, only to be stopped by Clara, who gripped her arm with surprising strength. "Lillian, wait. Look at them." Clara was right. As Lillian looked closer, she realized her mother and the others weren't just sad or tired. They were disconnected. Their posture was stiff, their faces devoid of any emotion, their eyes glassy and focused on the mirror disc. They were completely unresponsive to Lillian's presence. Suddenly, a hidden door on the far side of the vault slid open, and a figure stepped through. Director Sterling, followed closely by Miss Primrose, who carried a coil of thick, insulated wire. Sterling's expression was cold and triumphant. "I knew that locket would lead them here eventually," Director Sterling said, his voice echoing eerily in the marble chamber. He held up Lillian's ledger, which must have been found on the stairs. "The little spies. You've uncovered the secret of Blackwood Manor, but too late. You see, Lillian, your locket is quite special. It is a focus, a resonant key. It was the only way to activate the V1 and complete the process." Lillian backed away, pulling Clara with her. "What have you done to them? What is this place?" Director Sterling chuckled, a dry, horrific sound. "This is the Orphanage of Reflections. The children, the other orphans, they are merely the catalyst. Their small, undeveloped minds are ideal for the first part of the process, the separation." He gestured toward Agnes. Agnes had a particularly potent, vivid imagination. "We separate that essence, that pure self, from the body. That is phase 1. He walked toward the central disc, his hand resting on the cold obsidian. "This material, Lillian, is not mere polished wood. It is ether stone, found deep in the earth, and capable of holding an echo of the soul. The frames upstairs are small collectors, absorbing and storing the emotional essence, the identity of the children. They gather their fears, their hopes, their memories, everything that makes them them. The V1 down here is the transfer device. It doesn't reflect an image, it reflects an entire soul. Miss Primrose began attaching the wires to the base of the central disc, a look of feverish excitement on her rigid face. Your mother, Lillian, Sterling continued, his voice dropping in volume but losing none of its menace, was a brilliant woman. She developed the key to this process, but she lacked the final piece, a true emotional catalyst for the transfer. You see, the mind's essence, the pure soul, is too complex to transfer by itself. It needs a simpler, purer echo to guide it. The essence from one of the other children, a harvested soul, is used to map the path. Lillian realized the horror. The harvested children were drained of their souls, their essence used to create a conduit. We don't want the bodies, Lillian, Director Sterling concluded with a cold smirk. We only want the reflection, the perfect, empty vessel. We take the essence of someone like your mother, someone of genius, and transplant it into a new, younger body. The bodies in the cages, he gestured to the motionless figures, they are the recipients. The new, perfect reflections of the original identity. Soon, your mother's mind, her knowledge, her spirit, will be transferred into the body of that girl, and she will be reborn, perfect and compliant, into a new, endless existence. Lillian stared at the director, the realization of his terrible project twisting her stomach into a cold, hard knot. This wasn't about running an orphanage. It was about stealing souls and cheating death. Her mother wasn't just a captive. She was an involuntary participant in a horrific experiment designed to grant immortality to wealthy, influential patrons who sought to shed their old, failing bodies. The empty, available bodies of the orphans served as the perfect, untraceable containers. The frames, the clear reflection I saw in your study, Lillian whispered, her voice trembling. It was the perfect vessel, ready for an identity. Precisely, Director Sterling confirmed, a look of twisted intellectual pride on his face. The grand frame in my study is the final acceptance portal. Once the transfer is complete in the V1, the new reflection appears in the portal, ready for collection by the buyer. Your locket, my dear, contains a minute fragment of your mother's own soul, a keepsake that also served as the essential focusing component. Your appearance here tonight, activating the V1, was the final ingredient we needed to stabilize the transfer. Miss Primrose finished attaching the thick wires. She now stood by a small, complex console next to the central disk. Director, we are prepared for the activation sequence. Excellent, Sterling said, taking a step toward Lillian and Clara. But first, we must neutralize the threats. It would be a shame to waste two such vibrant young essences. Miss Primrose, prepare a second set of wires. We shall put their imaginative cores to use immediately. Clara, seeing Sterling distracted, whispered urgently to Lillian, the ledger. What did it say about the transfer vault? Lillian, remembering the blueprint, quickly opened the stolen ledger to the schematic. Her eyes flew to the red lines. Observation and transfer vault. V1. Danger. Resonance feedback loop, when active, must maintain a distance of at least 10 feet. A feedback loop, Clara hissed. That must be the weakness. It creates too much noise. Sterling and Primrose were advancing on them. They had only seconds. Lillian had an idea, a desperate, terrifying gamble based on the frame's sensitivity to her locket. Clara, the gas lamp. Lillian instructed, pointing to the flickering lamp Clara still clutched. Throw it at the central mirror. Now, Clara, without hesitation, reared back and hurled the lamp with all her strength. It shattered against the massive obsidian disc with a loud crash. Glass and oil sprayed across the highly polished surface, but the disc itself was undamaged. However, the momentary shock of the impact was enough. The obsidian disc reacted instantly. The humming became a deafening, frantic scream. The light in the room sputtered and dimmed violently, casting the marble vault into chaotic shadow and blinding glare. Director Sterling roared, covering his eyes. What have you done? Primrose stabilized the power. The noise was unbearable, a tearing, metallic shriek that felt like it was ripping the air apart. The massive obsidian disc, now coated in shards of glass and oil, began to flicker, the smooth black surface breaking into 1,000 points of light. The sheer energy feedback was overwhelming the system. Lillian realized the shattering of the lamp was not just a distraction, but an introduction of chaos that the highly precise transfer system could not handle. The ether stone was sensitive, and the oil was now interfering with its ability to resonate cleanly. Lillian and Clara used the distraction to bolt, scrambling toward the hidden door that Director Sterling and Miss Primrose had entered through. But Sterling recovered quickly. The door, Primrose. Don't let them escape. As Miss Primrose lunged for the door, she stumbled over a thick wire, falling hard onto the marble floor. In that moment of chaos, Lillian made a terrible decision. She had to use the locket again, not to open a lock, but to overload the system. She stopped at the entrance to the corridor, facing the V1. She held the silver locket out in front of her, facing the screaming obsidian disc. The locket was burning hot in her hand, the pulse rapid and frantic. She felt the surge of energy, a powerful, invisible wave rushing toward her from the disc. The essence of the harvested children, Lillian screamed over the shriek of the disc, addressing Director Sterling. You didn't use it to map the path. You used it to power the transfer. Sterling froze, his eyes wide, a flicker of genuine fear crossing his face. Foolish girl. Stop. You'll destroy the whole system. Lillian, ignoring the throbbing pain in her hand, channeled every fiber of her fear and desperation into the locket. The silver pendant acted like a lightning rod. The V1 disc, screaming, began to draw the energy not just from its internal power source, but from the massive network of frames throughout the manor and the locket itself. The cages holding the bodies of the recipients began to shake violently. Agnes, Lillian's mother, and the other girl cried out, a low, collective moan that sounded more like the creak of old wood than a human voice. The energy was tearing through them. Miss Primrose, recovering from her fall, scrambled to the console, trying to shut down the transfer, her face twisted in terror. The core is destabilizing. Director, the feedback loop is critical. Director Sterling lunged for Lillian, his hand outstretched to snatch the locket. Give it to me, you wretched child. Lillian dodged the attack, pulling the locket back. The surge of energy from the V1, now fully destabilized, was catastrophic. A brilliant, blinding white flash erupted from the central disk, followed by a thunderous crack that shook the very foundation of Blackwood Manor. The white light was overwhelming, burning out Lillian's vision for a terrifying, extended moment. When she could finally see again, the silence that replaced the scream of the V1 was absolute and shocking. The transfer vault was in ruins. The massive central obsidian disc was split clean in half, the etherstone surface smoking, its metallic hum dead. The power light on the console was dark, and Miss Primrose was lying motionless beside it, a scorch mark across her rigid uniform. Director Sterling, who had been lunging at Lillian, was now thrown against the marble wall, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, blood trickling from his temple. He was stunned, but conscious, staring at the destruction with a look of utter, heartbroken defeat. Lillian rushed to the cages. Her mother, Agnes, and the other girl were slumped on the benches. Their eyes were still open, but the terrifying emptiness was gone. They were simply unconscious, exhausted. The transfer had been violently aborted. Clara, pulling herself up from the floor, coughed in the dust-filled air. It's over, she whispered, looking at the broken mirror disc. You broke it. Lillian went to her mother's cage and rattled the bars. The transfer's failure must have unlocked them, for the latch immediately gave way. She pulled her mother out, supporting the older woman's weight. We have to go. We have to get them out. Director Sterling began to stir, groaning in pain. His eyes, full of a chilling, residual mania, fixed on Lillian. The project, years of research, destroyed by a child's trinket. You will pay for this, Lillian. The essence, it will dissipate. Lillian knew he was right. The harvested souls, the stolen identities waiting for transfer, were now free, their energy suddenly released into the closed system of the vault. A final, haunting terror occurred. As Lillian and Clara began dragging the unconscious bodies toward the exit, the fragments of the broken V, one began to emit a soft, pulsing light. The white marble walls, previously spotless, began to show swirling colors and shapes, like oil on water. Lillian looked up, and in the fractured, smoking surface of the shattered obsidian, she saw countless faint images swirling. They were the faces of the harvested children, the girls and boys who had been reassigned, their identities now escaping the broken stone. They were not screaming or raging. They were simply fading, like smoke in a breeze, a silent exodus of stolen souls. Clara tugged frantically on Lillian's arm. "Lillian, the other frames. The whole manor is going to shut down. We have to leave this chamber now." They dragged the three unconscious bodies through the hidden door, back into the narrow stone staircase, leaving the defeated director Sterling trapped in his crumbling transfer vault, surrounded by the remnants of his terrible ambition. The ascent was slow and agonizing, carrying the limp bodies up the tight spiral staircase. The metallic ozone smell was still heavy, but now mixed with the pungent scent of scorched wood and stone. They reached the top, emerging back into Director Sterling's study. The large, perfect obsidian frame behind the desk was cracked, its clear surface now warped and marred. The power was definitely failing. The moonlight from the window was now the strongest illumination. They left the ledger behind, its chilling contents no longer necessary. They had the evidence they needed, the unconscious, rescued victims. They were free of the underground vault, but they were still trapped in the Orphanage of Mirrors. Clara went to the study door and peeked out. The manor is completely dark. The power must be completely gone. The silence was eerie, amplifying every scrape of their boots and every ragged breath. They moved through the dark manor toward the front entrance, their path lit only by the slivers of moonlight filtering through the tall, narrow windows. Every step was fraught with the fear that Miss Primrose or Director Sterling would recover and intercept them. As they passed the grand hall, Lillian looked up. The hundreds of small obsidian frames, the blind eyes, were now utterly dark. They no longer held the vague, unsettling shadows. They were merely dark wood, inert and harmless. The power that fueled the entire, macabre network had been cut off at the source. They reached the massive oak front doors. The heavy iron bolts were secured, and the lock was intricate. "It needs a key," Clara whispered, desperately fumbling with the mechanism. The director's key, or the carriage driver's. Lillian's mind flashed back to the moment she had unlocked the vault. The locket was more than a focus. It was a universal key to the manor's obsidian-based locks. It contained the unique signature of the original creator's technology, her mother's design. She held the hot locket up and pressed it firmly against the main door's central iron lock plate. A faint, final mechanical clicks, almost a sigh, came from within the lock. The bolts slid back with a loud, ringing thunk. They were free. Lillian pushed the heavy doors open, and the cold, clean air of the pre-dawn morning rushed in, washing away the stench of ozone and fear. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the horizon with a pale, hopeful gray. They stumbled out onto the gravel drive, dragging the three limp bodies. Lillian took one last look back at the forbidding silhouette of Blackwood Manor, the Orphanage of Mirrors. It stood dark and silent, a tomb of lost souls, its hundreds of windows like dead eyes staring out at a world it could no longer harm. They made it to the edge of the property line, near the tree line, and collapsed, too exhausted to move further. Lillian's mother stirred, her eyes fluttering open, but she was too weak to speak. They had survived, but the fight was not truly over. They needed help. Lillian and Clara watched the sunrise paint the sky, a beautiful, impossible sight after the night of darkness and terror. Lillian's mother, though weak, was breathing steadily. Agnes and the other girl were still unconscious, victims of the violent shockwave of the transfer failure. Lillian knew they couldn't simply walk to the nearest town carrying three people. They needed transport, and they needed authority. Director Sterling and Miss Primrose were likely incapacitated, but they wouldn't remain so forever. Clara, practical as always, pointed toward the stables. The director's carriage. It's usually kept hitched and ready for his trips to the city. We can take it. Lillian and Clara, using their combined remaining strength, managed to carry the three bodies into the woods, hiding them deep under a thicket of pine branches, safe from immediate discovery. Then, with renewed determination, they made their way to the stables. The director's carriage was indeed ready. Clara, who confessed to having a childhood on a farm before the orphanage, was surprisingly capable. They quickly harnessed the two massive draft horses, their hearts pounding with the urgency of their escape. As they led the carriage out of the stables, a figure emerged from the shadows of the manor's back entrance, Director Sterling. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his dark suit torn, his face pale and contorted with pain and hatred. He had a small, antique pistol clutched in his undamaged hand. "You won't leave," he snarled, his voice a raw rasp. "You don't understand what you've ruined. Immortality. I will retrieve the vessels." He raised the pistol, his hand shaking, aiming for the horses. Lillian acted on instinct. She grabbed a heavy, rusted horseshoe lying near the water trough and hurled it with a desperate, wild heave. The horseshoe struck Director Sterling's injured arm with a sickening crack. The pistol clattered onto the cobblestones. Sterling screamed, falling to his knees. Lillian didn't wait. She and Clara leaped onto the carriage. Clara cracked the reins, and the heavy horses lurched forward, galloping down the drive. They didn't look back until the sprawling, Gothic silhouette of Blackwood Manor vanished completely behind the bend of the road. They drove hard until the midday sun was high in the sky, finally stopping near a bustling town. They sought out the local magistrate, using the stolen ledger as proof of their incredible, horrific tale. The magistrate, initially skeptical of two ragged orphans and a story of soul-stealing mirrors, was eventually convinced by the chilling entries in the book and the sight of the catatonic victims they had left in the woods. An investigation was launched. Lillian and Clara led the magistrate's men back to Blackwood Manor. They found Director Sterling and Miss Primrose gone, vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of the ruined transfer vault and the dark, inert panels of ether stone. The Orphanage of Mirrors was empty, a silent, haunted shell. Lillian was reunited with her mother, who, though profoundly changed by her ordeal, slowly began the difficult process of recovery. Lillian's locket, the key and the focus, was kept safe, a silent, powerful reminder of the darkness it had broken. Lillian and Clara, inseparable, found a new home in a small, kind village, their bond forged in the crucible of Blackwood's terrifying secrets. The manor was sealed, its terrifying purpose ended, a dark chapter closed in the history of upstate New York, leaving behind only the whispers of the children who had been harvested and the chilling memory of the blind eyes that watched from the walls. The wind that once carried secrets now carries only silence, and Blackwood Manor stands as a sealed testament to the darkness of human ambition. Lillian and Clara survived the Orphanage of Mirrors, not by strength of arms, but by the strength of a bond forged in fear and the power of a mother's love distilled into a simple silver locket. They escaped the chilling fate of the harvested children, the ones who were meant to become nothing more than empty reflections for others. But as they look out at their new life, under the warm, honest light of day, one haunting question remains. Is the darkness truly gone, or did Director Sterling and Miss Primrose, driven by their twisted vision, simply take their terrifying project elsewhere, waiting for the right moment to rebuild their orphanage of reflections? Let us know what you think happened to Director Sterling in the comments below. Did he escape? Did the manor claim him? And if you found this tale of shadows and secrets engaging, please hit the like button, subscribe for more cinematic stories, and ring that bell so you don't miss our next chapter. Until then, sleep well, and check your mirrors twice.